involved. So, starting with the creation and development of ISVEE, in the 1960s and 1970s, veterinary epidemiology was really just beginning to emerge as a significant discipline. And one of my pathologist friends used to repeatedly tell me, epidemiology is just common sense, right? It doesn't exist as a scientific discipline. There were a variety of groups. I've just listed 4 of them here: California, University of Minnesota, Weybridge Laboratory in the UK, University of Reading, and so on. And similarly for animal health economics, there were just small embryonic groups developing. There were no regular international meetings, and there was no journal that we could publish in that we could say was the journal of our field. So the seed was sown by Peter Ellis, who's now 98, so he doesn't come to ISVEE anymore. In the early 1970s, Peter established what was well known as VERU, the Veterinary Epidemiology and Economics Research Unit at the University of Reading. And in 1976, he held a conference called New Techniques in Veterinary Epidemiology and Economics. I've highlighted those words, new techniques, because one of the things we were desperate for in the 1970s was methods of doing epidemiology. We didn't have, if you listen to all the talks this week, about 98% of the techniques that people are describing, like DAGs, simply didn't exist in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So that meeting in 1976 was attended by somewhere around 100 to 150 people. And for the first time, we all met other people working in the field of veterinary epidemiology and animal health economics. And so it was a major stimulus to help continuing interaction. At that meeting, I undertook to hold a second meeting in Australia in 3 years' time. And that meeting took place 1979 in Canberra. Interestingly, it was a single session. We sat for 5 days all in the same room. There were no parallel sessions, no nothing. We were just all in the room for that entire time. So there was lots of good interaction among people. I decided if we were going to have continuity, we needed to have an organisation that held these meetings. So I wrote a constitution, we held a business meeting, and we created the International Society. And it doesn't exist in many senses. It doesn't have a headquarters. You can't write to an office or anything. You write to whoever's organising the next meeting. I also, about the same time, proposed, some of you may know Ken Plaxton, who was the original person responsible for PrevVetNet. I put a proposal to him in the 1970s that we needed a journal in the field, and preventive veterinary medicine appeared for the first time from Elsevier in 1982. So we now had an international society and we had a journal. Now this is where the second symposium took place. This is a very iconic building in Canberra, the home of the Australian Academy of Sciences. So you don't have meetings in places like that now, and that's where we all met. It seats 250 people, and those are luxury armchairs that you sat in with a personal writing desk in front of you. You don't get that sort of luxury in ISVEE meetings anymore. And that's my rather battered copy of the proceedings. So what happened in those days was you carried to the meeting the typed version of your paper, you gave it to the person running the meeting, and then after the meeting they were all retyped into poem form, and here we got a 700-page publication that was paid for by the Australian government. They would never pay for it nowadays, but they paid for it then. So no abstracts, no nothing, you just had a set of scientific papers that were actually quite influential because they covered a lot of epidemiological issues that had not previously been in a form you could read them. Posters hadn't been invented, right? There were just oral presentations. and all of the ISVEE proceedings are now on SciQuest in digital form, having been transferred from their printed versions in the early ones to electronic version and available on SciQuest. So you can read and research all of them. And I researched them in order to produce this talk this afternoon, just so I was checking what in fact we did in those times. So here's where the 17 ISVEEs have been held over the years. Now, why have I highlighted 3 of them in red? These were the ones where unusual things happened. After at the meeting in Canberra, the United States undertook to hold the next meeting. What they didn't tell us at that time was where they were going to hold it. And I actually moved to Minnesota in the meantime and discovered that there was a massive fight going on between the West Coast and the East Coast as to where the meeting would be held. And so I finished up mediating in Washington. The problem was that Washington had the money and Davis had the epidemiologists, so guess where it was held? In Washington. Sadly, I think there's never been a meeting in Davis. I think there should have been a meeting in Davis at the time. The second one was in Singapore over here. After the US meeting, there was one of the Asian countries, and I'm not going to say which, offered to hold the next meeting. But the people who had promised to offer the next meeting disappeared. We couldn't find them. So we got a year out from the meeting, and we had no organising committee, we had no place to meet or anything. And so Bill Hubbard, who was chairman of ISVEE at that stage, flew to Asia and went around the Asian countries and persuaded Singapore at the last moment to hold the next ISVEE. And so they actually ran an extremely good ISVEE, all went well, and then there was to be a proceedings, and the proceedings kept not appearing, and we eventually found out that this was the first meeting that was run by an organising company. Right? Previously, we'd run them ourselves. We found that the woman who ran the organising company had skipped the country with the money. And there was no money to print the ISVEE proceedings. So fortunately, the Singapore government stepped in and paid for the production of that proceedings. The third one was slightly different. Each organising committee, when it finishes, passes over the surplus money to the next organising committee. But after the Paris meeting, they refused to pass over the money to, they wanted to use it in France, and they refused to pass it over to the Americans who were to run the next meeting in Colorado. And normally, ISVEE business meetings, the only excitement is voting about where the next meeting is going to be held. But for those of you who know Mo Salmon took this very badly, and we had a massive exchange of opinions between the different groups in the ISVEE meeting. The only time there's ever been any real excitement in an ISVEE meeting. So, life of an epidemiologist in the 1970s. Oops, I better hurry. Basically, we did epidemiology by paper and pen, and I did a lot of economics in those days. And I taped together pieces of paper into a big sheet, drew lines on it, and we called that a spreadsheet. Right? And so I did all the economic analysis with a pencil on what we call the spreadsheet. The only analytical method we had was SPSS, which had appeared in 1968, and VisiCalc, the very first of the electronic spreadsheets, only appeared in 1979. And you hand wrote your papers, and the typist converted them into type form to send off to the journal, and everything went by snail mail. By the 1980s, there was a main focus on exploring new analytical methods and tools to carry them out. From 1981, we had the IBM PC, and so a whole set of tools became available over the next 10 years that we'd never had access to before. by the end of the 1980s, we started to get graphical user interfaces. And so we could start to do visual stuff that you couldn't do up to that time, of all kinds. And we all started to type our own papers. This was a major change. And we had fax machines, so you didn't have to rely on snail mail. By the 1980s, the internet gradually took over. We had more spatial methods, spatiotemporal analysis, social science methods, more wildlife, foodborne diseases, and gradually, by the early, I attended an Eco Health Alliance meeting of a small handful of people in just after 2000 that started to use the word One Health. We discussed how should we describe relationships. So One Health started to emerge, and aquatic epidemiology and other risk analysis in particular grew. I'm just hurrying now. Where's the chairman? Am I okay for a couple more minutes? So by 2010 and onwards, suddenly we've found over the last few years that people know what an epidemiologist is. Now that's one of the big benefits of COVID has been you don't have to explain to people what to do anymore. They all know what an epidemiologist is. And molecular epidemiology has been a major change in the way that we can analyse diseases. So finally, where to from here? Our field, in my view, has come from birth around late 1960s to adult. We now have a large group of people, we have masses of enthusiasm. Our meetings have grown from a couple of hundred to much larger numbers. We have thousands of people now working in the discipline. There are subgroups that meet independently, which is a sign of maturity in a discipline, that people still participate but break off to have more limited discussions. So I hope that ISVEE in the future, once I'm gone, can remain a way of growing together. We're now almost to 50 years. We'll be 50 years before the next ISVEE. That's, I think, quite remarkable. Will we last another 50 years? It's up to you. Thank you.